Hello everyone and welcome to this section of the course, which is going to be about c-betting in position in 3-bet pots. And I'm just going to make a couple of videos on this topic. We're going to start in this video by running through strategies on different boards. So I'm going to start by going over spots where we are, say, on the button and under the gun or cutoff has opened. And then I'm going to say a brief note about big blind versus small blind. So small blind's opened and we've 3-bet in the big blind. And I'm just going to go through the different pardon me, going to go through the different types of boards that we tend to look at. So disconnected flops, connected flops, paired flops, monotone flops. And so I'm going to do that for the overall strategies, go through stuff in PowerPoint. Hopefully that will give you a good overview of how to play on these boards. And then in the second video, I'm going to go over an example and just look at hand selection there. And we've gone over a lot of different hand selection examples in different spots. And I'm sure you've noticed that many of the same sort of themes are occurring. So I think just one example should do us fine here. So let's go on and let's start with disconnected flops. And as I said, this is where we have 3-bet in position and then it's not blind versus blind. So we're, say, on the button and we've 3-bet an earlier position opener. And starting with these sizing, so what sort of sizing are we going to be wanting to use on disconnected boards? And on ace-high flops, we tend to have a pretty good advantage low in the ranges due to the fact that we're sort of 3-betting a lot more ace-x than villain is raise calling versus a 3-bet. So we also have a bunch of high pocket pairs that villain doesn't have. So sort of deep down into the ranges, we tend to be having a pretty nice advantage. Villain also has a lot of hands with pretty poor equity versus our high pair heavy range. So when villains, like a lot of villains' defending range versus the 3-bet is lower to mid pocket pairs, and they have only got 2 outs versus quite a lot of our range when the board is high, like an ace high board. Pardon me, sorry. So yeah, with this sort of deep range advantage and also having extra bluff equity with marginal hands because of the overfolding that villain's going to have to do because of how many hands they have with low equity, then our hands are going to sort of get matched to smaller sizes than normal. Our better hands and our marginal hands more inclined to c-bet than usual. So our sizing is going to be relatively small. And we're going to go for something around 0.3 times pot is pretty good on ace-high flops. And again, if you go for third pot or quarter pot or whatever, it doesn't matter. Whatever suits the sort of style that you play in terms of what hotkeys and sites you play on and so on. But 0.3 times pot is pretty good. As the flop gets lower though, we tend to lose this sort of very deep range advantage. So as the cards on the board are getting lower, our opponent is going to be hitting them more often relative to us than they are when the cards are higher. So while we might still have a good advantage at overpairs on slightly lower boards, with this sort of deep range advantage that we have on the ace high flops disappears a bit. And by the time we get up to sort of queen to 10 high flops, a sizing like half pot is pretty good. And then if the flop's even lower, sizing can go a little bit up again, but not too much really. So again, if you wanted to really simplify the strategy, you could maybe go for something like third pot on ace high and king high flops, and then half pot on queen high or lower flops. And that's something very simple. If you want to be a bit more nuanced, then like sort of 0.3 times pot on ace high, going up a bit on king high, and up to about half pot by queen to 10 high, and a little bit higher again by on lower flops. And that is a little bit more accurate. But like I say, it's not going to be a big difference in EV if you just simplify things a bit there. In terms of frequency then, so we're going to have, like I said, these sort of very large and deep range advantages on most king high flops and also on high ace high flops. So I'll get to sort of other ace high flops in a minute, but if you have something like an ace king 8, then we're going to have an advantage at ace x. We're going to have more ace x than our opponent. We're going to have more king x than our opponent. We're also going to have ace king when our opponent doesn't. So we kind of got this advantage all the way through the ranges from near the top where we've got aces, kings, ace king, and then also having more ace x, more king x, and so on. So we just got the really big advantage on a sort of high ace high flop there, and we're going to c-bet 100% as a result of that. Also king high flops where we've got aces and ace king and pocket kings and so on, and also just tending to have more king x than our opponent. Again, we're very strong there, and we can c-bet 100% of the time. Queen to 10 high flops, we're still doing pretty well because we've got our high overpairs and plenty of top pairs still. So we can c-bet a high frequency overall on those sort of boards, queen to 10 high. And then our frequency is a little bit lower. So as default for ace high flops, while we have, like I say, quite a deep range advantage, our opponent still does have a lot of ace-x. So if we just have some sort of standard ace-high flop that's not particularly high, we're only going up to sort of a mid-high frequency. And we also have, of course, the thing that our marginal hands are less inclined to bet, all else being equal, on an ace-high board if our marginal hands are sort of ace-x and pocket kings, pocket queens, and so on, just because they have pretty bad bluff equity. Like most of the hands our opponent's folding has really poor equity versus our ace-x. So when we're on sort of a high board and our opponent's just really overfolding a ton, then we're betting very often still. But as a default on ace-high boards, like some standard ace-high board, we're still going to go with a small size, but we're only a mid-high frequency is going to be fine. And then also on the worst king-high flops, mid-high frequency, and then a mid-frequency on the worst ace-high flops for us. And what the worst flops are for us depends on the positions of the two players. So, for example, if villain opened in the cutoff, they're going to have all the low pairs in their range, lots of low suited connectors in their range, more often than we do when we're 3-betting. So we're also going to have plenty of sort of middling cards in our range. So if cutoff's open and we're on the button, we're 3-betting a relatively wide range. So we've got some like really strong hands, and then also some more middling cards, some like mid-suited connectors and mid pairs and so on, and ace-10, whatever else. So we're going to hit mid boards pretty reasonably there if villains open the cutoff, and villains can hit low boards pretty well. So we do the worst on boards with multiple low cards on them, basically. So on a wheel board, for example, an ace-5-4, that's going to be one of the worst ace-high boards for us if it's button versus cutoff. And then looking at sort of the other extreme, if our opponent opened under the gun, they're going to have fewer of the low pairs in their range and low suited connectors because they're not opening them and calling a 3-bet with them as often as they are if they're in the cutoff. Also, we are having a tighter 3-betting range, so a greater proportion of our 3-betting range is sort of the really high card hands, and less of it's the middling card hands. And with our opponent losing sort of the bottom end of the sort of lower cards from their range, a greater proportion of their range is the sort of the middling card hands. So if our opponent opens under the gun and we 3-bet the button, then something like an ace-10-9 or an ace-9-8 is going to be one of the worst ace-high flops for us. So, like I say, rather than the ace-5-4 or something if it's cutoff, button versus cutoff. And with that in mind, on low flops, we're going to be doing better button versus under the gun than we are button versus cutoff, because, like I've just said, cutoff is going to have more low cards in their range. So we go from c-betting sort of mid-frequency if we're button versus cutoff on low flops to a high to very high frequency if we're button versus under the gun. And sort of most of the important stuff going on in the ranges is the fact that we've got more of the high over pairs that our opponent would have been 4-betting if they had them. So we sort of got aces, kings, queens a lot, whereas our opponent would be 4-betting those hands a lot and they have the lower over pairs. So we've got a pretty nice advantage on low boards, button versus under the gun. So we will be c-betting sort of high to very high frequency there. So going on to connected flops, and there are some deviations in sizing based on board heights and positional matchups and so on, but a third pot actually works pretty well for connected flops as a whole. So we can really just go for a sort of third pot sizing here and not worry too much about adjusting it based on the different positional matchups or board heights. And yeah, I don't think there's going to be much EV gain from sort of trying to adjust from that for sort of small differences that you might get. Like some of the things I found, maybe it should go up to 0.4 or a bit higher, but yeah, like I say, not really important enough to bother trying to learn, I don't think. The reason that we're not seeing the sort of increase in sizing as the board gets higher, like we do on the disconnected flops, is that we tend to do worse at the top end of the ranges as the board gets lower. So that sort of cancels the effect that we saw on disconnected flops. So on the disconnected flops, we sort of had a deep range advantage on the higher disconnected flops. And then that deep range advantage was dropping down on the lower ones, but still we had a bunch of overpairs or what, so and whatever. So at the top of our ranges, we're still doing pretty well on the lower disconnected boards. So therefore our sizing is kind of going up because like the deep advantage is disappearing, but the higher advantage in the ranges is staying. So as we know, that will make our sizing go up. But yeah, on connected flops, our opponent's going to hit straights and two pairs and more sets than us and so on. So actually, while they do, while our advantage deep in the ranges is still going down, so is our advantage higher in the range. So we're not getting that sort of effect that our sizing is going up as the board gets lower. So just third pot's going to work well across all sorts of boards on these connected boards. in terms of frequencies then, so we've got nice easy sizing strategy, but frequencies, we're very strong on 3 Broadway flops. We're going to have far more high pairs, ace king, etc. in our range than our opponent is. So we're going to tend to be hitting these sets and 2 pairs on a 3 Broadway board. Also, if it's not an ace high, we're going to have aces where our opponent doesn't. So we're just going to be doing pretty well on these boards, and we can see about 100% of the time. Also, our opponent's going to have to overfold really significantly on boards like that, because you're imagining, say, an ace king queen flop and a bunch of our opponent's range is sort of 9s through deuces, then they're just doing terribly versus our range. They've got 2 outs versus our betting range, so they're just going to have to fold even when we're betting a pretty small size. So our opponent's overfolding turn, which again gives us higher bluff equity with our marginal hands because we're just getting more folds, and therefore driving us to this sort of 100% c-betting frequency. Remember that we hit mid cards better versus cutoff than we do under the gun. So when I'm saying here mid-high frequency on queens 10 high flops, we're hitting mid cards better versus cutoff than under the gun. So we're going to go a little bit higher than mid-high versus cutoff, a little bit lower versus under the gun onto the queens 10 high flops. But it's not a big deal. Like, we're not adjusting all the way up to high or all the way down to the mid in either case. So just going with a mid-high frequency is pretty decent. If you want to adjust it a little bit, that's obviously ideal, but difficult to make these small changes in our strategy anyway. So mid-high frequency, pretty solid there. And again, mid-frequency on wheel boards, but again, we're doing better on low cards versus under gun versus cutoff. So we're betting more than mid on wheel boards versus under gun and less versus cutoff. So some small deviations there based on position, but again, it's not really going up to a point where you'd actually change the category to mid-high or to mid-low or something. Low boards, again, we've got mid-frequency button versus cutoff, and then mid-high button versus under the gun. So this is similar to our connected boards where we had mid-frequency button versus cutoff, because cutoff's just doing better on low boards. But we're not going all the way up to high to very high like we did button versus under the gun on disconnected boards. We're just going up to mid-high, and that's because our opponent is still going to be hitting more sets and not necessarily more sets actually, but more straights and 2 pairs and so on a connected board than they are on a disconnected board. So at the top of the ranges, we're not doing as well as we tend to do on the disconnected boards. Like on the disconnected boards, there's maybe a few sets going on, but then it tends to be just the overpairs being the main thing straight away after that. And on the connected boards, it's kind of more at the top of the ranges where our opponents can be hitting better in terms of straights and 2 pairs and so on. So yeah, we're not betting quite as often on our connected boards, even button versus under the gun. So going on to paired flops, and button versus cutoff, things are pretty similar to disconnected flops. So one of the differences will be, though, that no ace high flops are particularly bad for us now. So when we were talking before, say button versus under gun, and ace 10-9 was pretty bad for us because our opponent, not that bad overall, but worse than other similar boards because our opponent might have more pocket 10s than us, more pocket 9s than us, more 10-9 suited than us. Whereas now, if we've got, say, an ace 10, then we don't care how much 10-9 suited our opponent has. We don't care how much pocket 9s they have. It's only the pocket 10s that are an issue at all. And this just means that it's far less significant what the other card is. So we've got ace X, it's far less significant what the X is than when we've got ace XX and we've got these 2 X's. And if they're both bad, then that's what's sort of driving our frequency down a little bit. But yeah, so any ace X basically we can see about 100% of the time. The same with king X. Did I say ace XX or ace X? I meant ace X anyway. But yeah, so ace X or king X we're going to be able to see about 100% of the time. And third pot sizing works pretty well, and button versus cutoff there as well. We have something similar on low boards now that villain will hit them less when there are 3 low casts hit, and we go for high frequency on all non-ace to king high flops. So again, so cutoff, we're worried, say on an ace 8-7-6 board or something, that our opponent's going to be hitting more 8-7s and 6s and maybe 8-7 and 7-6 and so on. So our opponent's going to be hitting better than us and also more straights than us. If we now change that board to say 8-8-6, then our opponent's going to have, like, there's less sets they can have, there's less 2 pairs they can have, and so on. They're going to hit more trips than us, and that's why we're not sort of c-betting 100%, despite the fact that we've got a nice advantage in terms of the high overpairs. But So that's sort of stopping us going to 100%, but we're still doing much better than we were on sort of a similar board, which is like a similar board which is not paired. So so we can go up to sort of high frequency on all other boards other than ace king. So basically paired boards we're going to be c-betting a lot, button versus cutoff, and then a sizing of sort of 0.6 times pot or so work pretty well across all the different boards. But again, if you want to go half pot or simplify it to whatever you tend to use, that's always going to be fine. So button versus under the gun, we do better on low flops because neither player has a ton of trips, but we have sort of a really big and significant advantage in these high overpairs. We also do very well on king king x and high ace ace x because of having more trips and high pairs. So we can c-bet 100% on all of those boards for button versus under the gun. So we were still c-betting 100% on ace king high flops. We're c-betting 100% button versus cutoff, and then going down to a high frequency on other ones. Button versus under the gun, like I say, we're going up to a 100% frequency on king king x, also low boards, and then also high ace ace x. So not all ace ace x, but high ace ace x. And then we reduce this frequency when we're on an ace ace x where the x is low, and also on queen queen x, jack jack x, and 10 10 x. And that's because villain has enough trips on ace ace x to stop our advantage being quite so big if the other card isn't also high, to give us sort of an extra advantage. And then villain hits more trips on the other boards, so that's driving our frequency down somewhat. So villain's got more queen x and jack x and 10x button versus under the gun than we do in the range. So that's and they've got enough of it that it's significant enough for us to drop our frequency down compared to, say, the lower boards where they still might have slightly more, but both players are going to have less. It's not really going to be significant enough for us to actually stop c-betting 100% of the time. So our sizing is bigger than everywhere else because of the importance of the pocket pairs in the ranges. Like, more of the ranges are made up of these pocket pairs, and we've got these high pocket pairs which are pretty strong. So sizing's bigger here, button versus under the gun, than it is elsewhere, on these paired boards specifically. And we want to go for sort of a half pot sizing on higher boards, and adding in a pot sizing as the board gets lower. And by the time the board gets really low, we're mostly using this larger size, and we're mainly sort of, we have very little that's hit the board on a lower flop there. It's mostly just the really high overpairs that are driving our sizing strategy, and they're pretty good, so we can mostly be going with pretty big sizing there. We can tweak the sizings further on high boards if we think about it. So on something like an ace king king, we have such a big advantage. Like, we've got pocket aces, pocket kings, ace king. We've also got more king x, more ace x, and so on. Just got a huge advantage throughout the ranges. And our opponent's going to have to overfold an absolute ton. Like, they've just got a ton of hands with 2 outs versus a lot of our range, and even hands with 0 outs, basically, if they've just got lower or mid suited connectors. Pardon me. So we can have actually a really small sizing there of sort of 1/6 pot. And then also, we're doing so well at the top of the ranges that we can kind of balance that range with our strong hands and have some left over to bet a second size of 3/4 pot or so. So if we're really thinking about it and we have a really, really high board like the ace king king, we can go for something like a 2-sizing strategy of 1/6 and 3/4 pot, betting 100% of the time. And then on an ace ace, something like moving the board down a bit, something like an ace ace jack, we'd be going to sort of our sizing of 3rd pot or so, since our advantage isn't quite so large as it is on the ace king king. And then if we move something down to having the x low, so ace ace 5, that's where we're giving up on c-betting 100% and sort of going with the our default of mid frequency with half pot sizing. So so you can tweak it a bit more if you want to, but just going with these sort of defaults that I'm giving you are going to be pretty solid overall. Now, it's going to be rare you get these specific paired boards where it would really be a bit better to use a different strategy. But yeah, overall, I think you're going to be fine if you just follow what I've got here in the slides. So monotone flops, we have fewer suited hands in our 3-bet range than our opponent's flat range pre-flop. So I'm not going to bother bringing the ranges up, but just to sort of explain that a bit, we've got 45% of our range pre-flop is suited hands compared to 51% of our opponent's range when we're button versus under the gun. So a slight disadvantage there, and then it's even a little bit more button versus cutoff, so 45% versus 54% of our pre-flop range being suited hands. So doing even a little bit worse there. In both cases, our ranges are a bit more ace-x suited heavy than our opponent as well. So we'll do even worse on ace-high monotone flops, and we'll bet a little bit less than otherwise expected there. But yeah, in general, we're going to be at a bit of a disadvantage at the top of the ranges on monotone boards. So not going to be using particularly high frequencies and particularly big sizings as a default. And if we do use a default of just over a mid frequency with a sizing of about third pot, that's going to be pretty good. We can adjust that in the direction of betting more often on boards where we'd be betting often if it weren't monotone, and betting less often on boards where we'd be betting less if it weren't monotone. And we can actually adjust quite significantly from the default, because we do have to remember that now the like stacked pot ratio is smaller when we're looking at 3-bet pots compared to the single raise pots that we looked at earlier in the course. The sort of top of the ranges, as I've said before, is a little bit less important than it was. Like if we're in a single raise pot and we've got 10% of our range beating 98% of our opponent's range, so like 10% versus 2%, 2 pair plus or something, then it's going to be really we're really going to consider using quite a big sizing in order to get a lot of money in over multiple streets. Whereas when the stacked pot ratio is smaller and you can get all the money in quite comfortably using smaller sizings, then that's not so important, the sort of 10% versus 2%. And if it's like 1% versus 5% at the top of the ranges or something, that's not really a big deal. It's only as you get down into sort of the 10% and lower parts of the ranges that it's starting to become more important where these sort of advantages lying. So yeah, a little bit less significant than on single raise pots where we saw sort of a more uniform strategy over monotone boards, because it's really quite important that we had this like how the ranges are interacting right at the top of the ranges. But still, it is still significant here because there are enough suited hands for both players that it is still quite a big chunk of the top of the ranges that are made up by flushes, but just a little bit less significant. So there's more sort of adjusting to be done here in terms of this board's actually pretty good for us if we ignore the flush, so we're still going to bet a reasonable amount more than this mid-frequency default, or this board is particularly bad for us, so we're going to, like, if we ignore the monotone, so we're going to bet quite a bit less than the mid-frequency. But a sizing of 1/3 pot's going to work pretty reasonably overall. So final thing I'm going to go over in this video is just a couple of points on big blind versus small blind play. And I'm not going to go into this in a huge amount of detail, partly because it works quite nicely in terms of having a default that's going to work pretty well in most scenarios. So I don't think it's going to be worth sort of going into a bunch of detail about how to adjust that small amounts in lots of places in terms of the sort of effort that goes into learning it compared to the sort of EV output we're going to get. And then secondly, it's just that I think you're going to see more variation depending on what games you play. Obviously, if you're playing high stakes against the best players in the world, you might not see so much variation. But in general, you're going to see people who don't limp at all from the small blind. So people who are just playing raise fold, people who are limping quite different ranges and so on, different sizings and whatever else. So I think learning a sort of good default that's you can use quite widely is going to be better than trying to tweak things too much, and then versus a lot of the people you play, it's just totally not ideal against how they're playing anyway. So we're just going to go, like I say, for a pretty vague overview here, but it does actually work pretty well for most scenarios. And the first thing to say is that we've got a more polarized 3-betting range than other positions. So we're 3-betting a bunch of strong hands from the big blind, but also a bunch of hands as weak as sort of 10-7 off or something that we would never consider 3-betting button versus cutoff. I'm actually even going to bring up the range. So if I open up, let's open up here. So if we hover over our 3-betting range here, you can see that we have all these sort of strong hands, the aces, ace king, ace queen, pocket kings, and so on, and the other sort of pretty high pairs. Then we kind of have this gap where we're not really 3-betting a bunch of these hands, like ace 9 suited, ace 8 suited, king 8 suited, etc. And then we have a bunch of the weaker hands that again we are 3-betting, and even with offsuit hands, like I say, so we got 10-7 offsuit here, 3-betting a bunch of the time, and king 4 offsuit 3-betting sometimes, and so on. So really 3-betting more polarized range, and that's just going to mean that we're bring this back in. Oops, let's go back one. So it's going to mean things are more evenly spread across different flops, basically. So we don't have this thing where our range, where we've 3-bet kind of just this top corner of our range, and therefore we're doing really well on the high boards and missing a bunch on the low boards. We're not really having that so much. We're still hitting the low boards more often. We're hitting the high boards less often. So things are much more evenly spread, and we can actually have just a sort of default of betting around mid frequency on most flops, and that's going to be absolutely fine. We're tending to bet a little bit more often than that on low flops because we have more bluff equity in general with betting marginal hands on low flops. And so, if the numbers are looking pretty similar in terms of how the ranges are matching up, but then we've got more bluff equity with our marginal hands in a certain spot, we're going to bet more often in that spot. And that's the case on the lower boards, just got a bit more bluff equity there. Our opponent folding more overcard hands versus our bets. So we're betting more often on the lower boards a little bit, and also on king high flops we do actually still hit a little bit better. That tends to be often the case, actually, as you've probably noticed. Like king high flops really tends to be pretty good for the aggressor because you tend to have aces that the opponent doesn't, and ace king, which it's just this extra little thing that's not so apparent on most other boards. If it's a queen high flop, your opponent quite often has a lot of ace queen, and maybe even more than you. But ace king, you're pretty much always going to have more than your opponent does if you're the aggressor. So low flops and ace king high flops you can bet a little bit more often, and then so all in terms of the sizing, although you do see lots of different sizings used in different boards, it's not really so clear as like we're just betting this size on low boards, this size on high boards. It's more sort of smaller effects going on in terms of first of all, because you're tending to hit different cards relatively evenly, so you're kind of having an okay range advantage throughout ranges often, rather than like really concentrated on like we got really good high in the ranges here and not so good lower, or and therefore we're going to bet big, or we're really good lower and not so much higher, so we're definitely going to bet small. Tends to be more like EV of betting different sizes, probably going to be pretty similar, and just using a default sizing of around half pot, I think it's going to work pretty well here. So you can adjust it if you start to get really comfortable with how the ranges are matching up, and you've really got a good idea of how your opponent's playing, what their range is, and therefore you can kind of think like, okay, I've really hit this flop well at the top end, or my opponent's really like missed this flop at the top end or something. Then you can start to think about maybe changing your sizing strategies, but that's really quite advanced play. Not really something I'd even be looking to do myself, having spent loads of time on it. So if you get to that stage, congratulations. But yeah, I think just going with their mid frequency and half pot sizing is going to be absolutely fine here. So so that's going to be it for the strategies. I know I've kind of whizzed through a bunch of stuff there without really looking at a lot of examples. So I hope that it's kind of going to stick all right and it wasn't too much of a grind for you guys watching it. But obviously feel free to ask me in the Facebook group if there's any issues with it, if you need clarification. But hopefully that was useful, and I'm going to go on the next video talk about some hand selection on a 9-8-4 board, and we're going to talk about how we play different hand types as we usually do, and pretty much some exploitative stuff there as well. So I shall see you for that.